Little or nothing is provided at school or beyond in the way of general or formal education about organisations. Whatever we learn comes more tacitly from our experience of finding ourselves in organisations. I'd like to go a little deeper by exploring my own experience growing up and working in organisations.
Hello and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates along with Peter Garrett. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. And we're doing this by exploring the chapters of Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. Over the last 2 episodes, we saw how a chance request brought dialogue into prisons, where the practice thrived and did a great deal of good and continues to do so. But in this episode, we see how dialogue moved into the corporate world of organisations, which, as Peter says, is a pervasive area of fragmentation that clearly needs it. At the end of the episode, we'll be joined by guest Meg Bower. Meg spent 2 decades employed in corporate America as an expert in strategic planning for capital facilities. She went on to start her own micro-enterprise to bring her values and talents fully into her work. We'll be hearing her question in a bit. So, Peter, we've got 4 chapters to cover in this episode. We start with the chapter Encountering Organisations. And once again, we're going to hear a bit about your experiences and what you learned about organisations as a result. We go back to school. You were not taught about organisations at school. So on reflection, what did you learn about organisations through your experience at school?
I guess my first day at school is a memory. Most people, if you ask them, do you remember your first day at school?
Yes.
Remember where you hung your coat on a peg or whatever it was that marked it for you?
And right? The smell. Do you remember the smell of school?
Absolutely. So for me, the first day at school was was the first organisation I really encountered. I know some people are in foster homes or whatever, but for me, I was with my mother and father and sister, and I had plenty of scope to organise things at home in the way I liked it. When I went to school, I realised it was a completely different thing. Like, I didn't especially want to go. You mentioned the smell. I didn't like the smell of the building. I had to stay all day and eat, and I didn't like the food I was given. I thought it was food I'd never eaten before. Roast pumpkin. I remember I had real battle eating that. But also my mother wasn't very happy. She looked quite distraught as she kind of backed off. So I thought, this is like quite a big deal. What's happening? I couldn't quite formulate it that way, but that was what I was thinking. And if you step back from that day, almost every weekday of my life for the next 40 years, I left home and went into an organisation. So it's a pretty key day. I know now mothers don't just disappear, they stay, or you go for an hour or 2 and build it up and so on. But it's a very big transition from being home being your container, where you're comfortable and where you're operating, to then being in an organisation that has a different set of rules. It has teachers, it has authority, it has things you have to do, has colleagues, peers that aren't available at home in the same way. So on reflection, I learnt a lot about organisations from my first day at school and then watching my children go to school.
What would you say was the first lesson? You've described your first day at school. What was the lesson about organisations that you learned?
Well, at home I had much more say in what happened. I could say I don't like that, or I'd rather do this or whatever. I could negotiate a bit or influence what was happening. At school, you don't have that say. The teachers are in charge and they determine what's happening. And so I learned you have to go along with what's happening at a different kind of place. And as I went on, of course, I found they had quite a bit of authority to direct what happened and what didn't happen. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
My daughter has a wonderful sociology teacher who taught her A-level sociology class about this, because one of the boys in the class was laughing at something somebody said when they were talking about control in school. So the teacher said to him, "Matthew, stand up." And he stood up immediately. And the teacher said, "Is there anywhere else where somebody would just tell you to stand up and you would do it?" He said, "No." Great lesson. One lesson learnt. Yeah. There's probably a lot more to be said about organisations and schooling. Why isn't it important that children learn something about those constraints of organisations?
Yeah, you won't succeed in an organisation if you don't understand how to behave in it. Where I was at school, if you didn't behave in the way that was required, then there were punishments of various kinds. And it wasn't necessarily fair, it was simply how it worked. So you realised you had to abide by the authority of the teachers, but also you had to manage well with all your colleagues. So there's a bit of a challenge. I mean, you have to realise the way in which power is executed in organisations may or may not be healthy or appropriate, So there's some tough things around organisations which we all experience for years afterwards, where decisions are made that affect us. We have to stomach them and work out how to play with them. So you do learn that at school. You have to learn that at school. It's helpful you do.
Can you tell us, we've had your first day at school. What about your first day and your first paid role?
My first paid work, I remember, was on my grandfather's farm in Yorkshire. We were on holiday from Africa over and stayed on the farm for maybe a month, maybe a bit longer, 6 weeks. And I was a farm hand, and it helped the harvest, lifting up all the bales of straw and stacking them into haystacks and so on. I remember the first pay packet I got was a brown envelope. I remember having this money, man. It wasn't my parents' money, or I could spend it on whatever I wanted. And I eventually bought myself a pellet gun. That was the point I realised that there's great advantage in working. You get paid, I happen to enjoy doing that, but equally I did quite a few jobs that I didn't enjoy so much, but I did it for the money, because with the money I could do what I did want to do. But it's an exchange, yes.
Tell us about one of the jobs you didn't enjoy.
Well, not long after, I got a job in a builder's merchants, where I was one of the guys unloading all the timber and all the supplies that came into the yard for people to come and buy. And every week, a cement lorry would come, and it would have 100-weight bags of cement. It's 112 pounds, I don't know what that is, 30 or 40 kilos. It would have 20 tons of cement. Two of us would have to put these bags of cement on our shoulder and walk them into a shed. And I found that almost overwhelming, the amount of energy involved. I thought, this is not a fair exchange. I'm overwhelmed with this.
That was a manual job. You did a number of manual jobs.
I did.
Do you want me to tell you what they are? Things like you worked in a paper mill, you were even a barman packing Christmas hampers.
Right.
But you also did a number of clerical roles and more white-collar work. Is there anything to be learnt about the difference between the contract of a manual worker with the organisation and somebody who's more clerical, or is it the same?
Manual work is more obvious. It's kind of, there's the lorry, end up with the cement in the warehouse kind of thing. The clerical work, you can't see the whole cycle. You've got your little bit of it to do. So by and large, I found working clerical work. I mean, I think the first real clerical job I had was with a bank in London. I remember coming into the bank and not really knowing, I know what banks are like, I know you go and get money there and deposit money, I didn't really understand what the business was or how it worked. And I was in charge of some accounts and recording what happened with them. It took me a long time to work out actually what the business was. They'd said, okay, you've worked in a bank for a year, why don't you go and start a bank? And I said, I've no idea how you would start a bank. Actually, I did start a bank later out of interest, but at that time, it was just I did the bit that I was defined to do. So I think that's the thing about clerical work. It's quite hard to see the whole process unless you're higher up in the organisation.
Yes.
And by and large, you're working out early on what to do and how to do it, what's required, what's expected.
Yeah. Whereas if you're carrying a bag of cement or the bricks, you know where they're going and you can see them going into the building.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
I think there are better inductions now than I had. I think there are some where I didn't. But even where I had good inductions, you've still got to work out what happens. Like I worked for a property development company and had an expense account. I'd never had an expense account. Like, what's an expense account for? Well, presumably it's to spend money to deal with customers and clients to get them to use you. I didn't need that. I didn't spend my money. But all my colleagues did use their expense account quite liberally. And eventually they turned on me and said, you're not using your expense account. We're going to lose ours if you don't use yours. So they made me use my expense account. And you realize then it's not just the way power is distributed in the organization, it's also how do you work with your colleagues. I guess now you'd call it culture, wouldn't you? There's a way in which things work, and if you don't respect that, you find yourself ostracized. If you have to find out what are the unspoken rules and expectations, as well as what are the overt requirements, and how do you use your discretion to manage both of them in a way that gets you through some contradictions, which are very hard to manage, you know? Mm.
We heard in one of the earlier episodes a bit about your parents and about your father. You seem to learn a bit about organisations and how to behave in organisations through watching your father. Can you say a little bit about the influence that he had on you, what you learnt from him?
Can do. I guess my reflections from childhood on, from first day at school and earning and being an employee and gradually becoming a manager and then running businesses and so on, was what are organizations and how do they work? You might say, well, why be preoccupied with organizations? Because we can't get away from them. Right now, we're in a recording studio that's run by an organization. The distribution of this podcast will be by an organization. When you look at it, the proliferation of organizations is the extraordinary thing of our time. So when I worked on my grandfather's farm, looking at my grandfather, in his youth, there were far fewer organizations and most people lived and worked on the land. Now the majority of people live in urban areas and work in organizations. So I've been trying to look at them from the bottom to the top and understand them. It happened that my father opened up an insurance company for a UK company in Africa. That's why I ended up in Southern Africa as a child. And later, when he retired from that job, he opened another business. And I remember sitting down with him where he was with a piece of paper working out what the business might look like and what its name might be, just playing with the different words. And I remember saying, well, why don't you make it this? Because an abbreviation would be that. And we ended up, it was Barclays Insurance Brokers South Africa Limited, which abbreviated, I told him, as BIBSOL, which would be quite good. But there I was with the CEO, what was to be a CEO of a very large and successful organization when he was thinking about starting it. That's very different from coming at the bottom and doing a task amongst many and not understanding where it fits. So I enjoyed talking with him. He hired everybody in his organization. He grew it very rapidly, became a very large and successful organization, the first insurance brokerage, actually. So he gave me the view from the top down, which would have taken me longer to find otherwise.
Yeah, good. So you did go on to run businesses yourself, and the next chapter is titled that, Running Businesses. Again, there's many experiences that you had, but we'll pick up on a few of them. You took on a scaffolding depot, and in your typically developmental way, you were soon expanding, you had lots of business, and you wanted head office to buy you a second delivery lorry. Maybe it's a bit like the building you were just talking about. It's helpfully graphic to imagine the scaffolding and wanting another delivery lorry. Can you tell us what happened and why this incident was relevant to your understanding of how organisations work?
Yeah, so as I worked my way up from being an employee, you then become a supervisor and manage other people. In this case, the business, a scaffolding company, had about 30 branches around the country, and I ran one of them in Battersea. Battersea is where the dog home is, and I was right near there, under the arches of the underground. So every 7 or 8 minutes, the tube would rattle overhead. But in this case, it was a business where I could see the whole business. I was the manager of the branch. I had a salesman, an ex-fireman who used to drive around finding business to rent or sell scaffolding to builders around where building development was happening. I had a secretary. It's quite a raunchy business, being in builders, and she was quite raunchy. We either sold or hired scaffolding, which was erected, and she used to enjoy answering the phone and saying, "Hello, do you want sales or would you like an erection?" Which used to amuse me, so I didn't stop her doing that. And I had a yard where I had a yard foreman and 3 workmen. And what we did was they had lorries which had a removable back. They'd drop a back down and it would get loaded with scaffolding and scaffold planks while another was being delivered. They'd come back and pick up the new load and drop off the empty one, and they were continually loading backwards and forwards. But what I had was the whole balance sheet of that branch. So I could see what money we were making, where we were making money, where we weren't. And it was a good business. I mean, this is a long time ago, but if I'd stayed longer, I reckon we might have made £1 million on that one depot. And so it was a good business. But the requirement from head office was you could have 1 lorry with removable backs. Well, as I built up the business, I had to hire another vehicle. So I had a hire vehicle all the time. And I could see on my sheets that cost a lot of money. So I wasn't making the profit I could. Then I got to 2 hire vehicles. So I had 3 vehicles. I could only own 1 and the other 2 were hired. And my bonus was based on my profits, and I wasn't making money because I was having to hire them. So this is the point at which I thought, these guys in head office don't know what's going on here. If any of them came down here, they would say, buy another vehicle, buy 2 more vehicles, this is sustainable business. But they couldn't, and they wouldn't. They were a function somewhere else that was managing their capital expenditure. So that was the beginning of realizing that head offices, which manage a large distributed business, think differently from people on the ground who deliver the business, the operations that make the money, in fact. So I was seeing the one side of that pretty vividly, and I did at times criticize head office.
At the same time, you were managing a team of staff, the raunchy secretary and some others. What was your approach to managing staff, and what were you learning about managing people then?
I learned when I went to a wedding that I didn't raise that story because it would have embarrassed her badly at a wedding. But
you can't always say everything, can you, as you learned at school? Yeah.
No, what you learn is that people work better if they understand how they're contributing to what's happening and feel that they are making a contribution. People like to contribute and have things work. They like to see things succeed. So there's something about talking with people to understand how the business works, which is something I couldn't see in my earlier career, and seeing where they fit in and how it was going, and showing them the figures and showing them the results and also acknowledging them. So I wouldn't have said, people say things like, people are our greatest asset. I think that's a lot of cobblers. Do the people with you know what they're doing? Are they equipped well enough to do it, and do they enjoy doing it? And where they are, of course, they're very faithful and enjoy it. And then you find people are not so happy. And I remember the first time I had to fire somebody. I remember the first legal summons I got. This is like, I don't have them personally, but the business has it. What do I do? Firing somebody is an interesting one. You're going to affect somebody's life by saying, I'm sorry, but we no longer need your employment. We're not going to pay you anymore. And of course, you've got to have a good record and understanding of how you do that. What I found with the first man I did fire, who was unhappy, was talking with him, discovering why he was unhappy, discovering what he really needed and wanted to do, helping him think about that. And by the end of the conversation, he and I both thought that he should go until we arranged a suitable time where he could go and get on with what he did need to do. And that was quite a surprise. So when you hear about, it's by mutual agreement that the director left, sometimes it is. Sometimes at executive level, talking it through, it would be better for me to move, in fact. So it's not always a euphemism that we fired, but we said we left by mutual agreement. If you're a good manager, that's likely to be the case, that you're supporting somebody's development.
Mm. In one of the earlier episodes, you talked about used the term container, and you described seeing that in the relationship between Jenny, your wife, and your daughter Sarah when she was a newborn child, and the relationship particularly around breastfeeding and the responsiveness of Jenny to Sarah. What did you discover at this time about that kind of healthy container within a business context?
Well, it's exactly the same thing. In describing a mother and breastfeeding child, that's very much about timing, being sensitive to what's needed, and good timing really works. And if you have the rapport, the conversations that don't need to be huge, but the right conversations with people you're working with, you have an environment which is pleasant to be in, you find the timing is quite good. Not, I'm going to take my holiday then and it won't work. People accommodate each other in an aware way, if you like. But I also mentioned in relation to accidents. Don't you remember I was saying I don't think there's such a thing as an accident. The information is there. But accidents relate a lot to containers as well. If you have a good container, a small incident flags up. We need to just be a little more thoughtful, a little more careful. If you have a poor container, that's where you have your lorry comes off the road and you haven't got a vehicle for 2 weeks and you have to do other things and so on. That's where people get injured. I described in terms of the kids next door in the room getting too rowdy. You realise the guys loading the vehicles aren't doing it as carefully as they need to. That hasn't been strapped down the way it should be. I can tell by the way he drew out of the yard that man's in a rush. We don't need to be in a hurry. We need to do this well. Yeah. So that kind of sensitivity and creating a container, people lean into it when you do. They like it. They enjoy it. And you've got to be very thoughtful you don't have it. I remember having a secretary who just was, whatever we did was not, she didn't like and didn't work. And I realised in the end, I've got to take her out for lunch. We've got to go out and have a good lunch. And we had a good lunch, and lo and behold, she feels acknowledged and accepted and heard and included, and on we go. Now, you could say, well, this is just good management or good leadership, but it's leading us from these insights into how dialogue in turn will affect how you develop this culture, how you develop the rapport and so on. Culture is kind of collective behaviour, isn't it? But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a container. You say to people, what's culture? I don't know. It's kind of, well, the culture's good or bad. No, culture's quite clear and quite discernible. It's the way in which we expect ourselves and other people to behave. The culture which is there can affect all sorts of things around decision-making and around how you operate. So the reflections are leading into the kind of dialogue that we've developed as professional dialogue.
Mm. Mm. I was wondering if the listeners at this point might be thinking about places they've worked and listening to your experiences and what you learned, and maybe compare that to their experiences and what they've learned. If you've ever been in an organisation where it's felt really healthy and safe and you felt like you can grow and develop, and also those where you feel like you're not that safe and you can't grow and develop, and what were the qualities of those organisations and the impact that they had on us as individuals and people around us.
Particularly if you're working with machinery or you're working in a prison and doesn't feel safe, then you've got something really does have to be addressed.
Yeah. There is no simple way to cover all of the different businesses that you ran, but you ran a couple of businesses. Can you just tell us about the couple of businesses that you began and set up in your importing days?
Yes, the scaffolding I was employed by somebody else, and so I was running on their behalf. I think, I don't know if I remember them all, but I did help start a hotel. So I became a hotelier, and I had a 20-bedroom hotel and a small staff, 6 of us ran. I was the manager and the barman, and it was terrific, actually. How do you run a hotel? Same thing, really. You work out how it works. This was 1 star, so people don't complain too much, which was good. I went on then and took on a 3-star hotel. Got colleagues running it, and that's a bigger animal. People complain a bit when they know what they want and whether they're getting it or not. Then I went on and marketed a hotel chain and went around. That was different. Managing a hotel, you've got a team, you're there every day, you're working with them. Marketing a hotel chain, you're on your own. No team, you report in, you get your figures. That difference didn't work for me, and I learned quite a bit about that, how being promoted doesn't necessarily put you in the place you need to be. But as well as hotel, I was over in South Africa on holiday and met someone, and it led to me importing motor accessories. So I imported accessories for cars, and that initially a few samples of what were a sliding sunroof, fitted and built up sales, gradually got a good distribution around the UK, started wholesaling into European countries. Eventually, I think one year I brought in something like 30 20-foot containers full of sunroofs from South Africa. It was a big business. I can tell you the demise of them as well, but later I began importing women's fashion clothing in the rag trade area north of Oxford Street in London. Again, I began with a few samples, showed a few people. My first sample in a duffel bag, I had a dozen samples. I got a sale for £17,000 worth of clothing. Cold calling. I thought, wow, this is the business to be in. So I opened my own showroom, imported large quantities of women's fashion clothing.
So your learning about organisations has come from a very broad set of experiences.
I did like to try and do things well, do them in the way that I believed I and others would really enjoy them. And I also like to push to the limit, and that's why a number of them closed. So it wasn't I couldn't hold down a job. I did a lot of jobs well, but I grew them to try and get to the limit of them, I guess. Yeah.
So I'm going to move on into the next chapter of your book, which is the beginning of your consultancy work.
Right.
Consultancy immediately sounds so worlds apart from talking to people about rubber mallets and making sunroofs fit. And there's a huge amount again here. That began with you being invited to join Bill Isaacs in his US consulting company Dialogus and join him, I think. Do you want just to set the context a bit for this transition in your career?
Yeah, so just to be clear, if you're employed, you have a contract with the employer. You give your time and energy and skills, and they give you money. If you rise to more senior executive levels in an organization, you're designing those contracts for people. You're saying, we need this kind of person, let's define the contract that we have with them. So you're managing the contract. When you get to running your own business, you're then managing the whole thing. If it succeeds or fails, it's up to you. So you have a very different level of responsibility when you're running your own business. Consulting is a step further. As a consultant, you're outside the business. So the business, whether it's large or small, you're not a permanent employee. Now, the big thing is you're not permanent. You're dispensable. So as a consultant, if you're useful, they pay you and you come back. If you're not useful, they don't need you. That really does get you clear about what you're contributing and what you can do. So the consulting work gave you the view of the whole from the top to the bottom, in and out, its growth, its development, where it's working, when it's not, its decision-making processes, cultures, and so on. Now, I hadn't had much experience at that level. I had known Bill Isaac since he was at university as a student, so we had a good friendship. And joining his company, I'm indebted to Bill to have had access to large international organizations and seeing how they worked. I was quite naive about some of their systems, but I had a lot of first-hand experience under my belt, so I was able to be useful all the way. But I did learn a lot working with Bill, not only with Bill because of the clients he brought, which were international, multinational organizations, teams from them, but also because of the faculty on the programs we ran. So that was where I met David Cantor, for example. You'll notice there's a lot of Davids in my life. David Bohm, Dave Parsons, David Cantor. But David Cantor was a terrific guy, and we could talk about him, and no doubt we will, maybe in the next session. But so thank you, Bill, for giving me access to seeing at these levels.
And though we're here talking about your book, people who don't know Bill Isaacs, haven't heard about him, he wrote an early book about dialogue, The Art of Thinking Together, I think, which is worth putting that context out there. With Bill, one of the experiences you describe as offering a lot of learning was developing a program called the Leadership for Collective Intelligence, which I myself attended, I think, in the year 2000, round about then. Can you say a little bit about what that entailed and what you learned, what was different for you?
It entailed people like you arriving and thinking that oil companies were full of nasty people who were destroying the world, and leaving finding that oil companies were run by people just like you and me who were doing a pretty good job propping up all our pension funds, if I remember accurately.
I think you do.
No, the idea that Bill had was to invite teams of people from different organizations to meet together for a week every second month over a period of 8 or 9 months. And in between, they'd run projects and get coached. And so I was on the faculty of that with Bill, a guy called Michael Jones, who was an extemporaneous pianist, David Cantor and others. It varied each program. But the big thing there was seeing how a team of people might start to introduce some dialogue for the benefit of the organization they worked with. And the question was how to choose areas in the organization which were hurting, for which they had no real approach to better, to ameliorate, to get working, and how dialogue might make a difference there. So that was a great learning, a great revelation for many of them, and some terrific work was done. Some of it spun off into consulting work, and we can talk about that later, but it was a great introductory program, and Bill ran that for many years, so a lot of people have been through that program and been a great contribution to developing dialogue in the world, I believe.
In the episodes where we were talking about your work in prisons, you had a practice there which you used the phrase where everybody learns and nobody teaches. you go from that to, on this leadership for collective intelligence, teaching is part of the process. Can you say what the advantages and disadvantages were of that shift?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, partly the value of writing a book, is you can trace the whole journey of the development of dialogue. And the early dialogue was to understand fragmentation in consciousness, how that comes about. So it was a particular kind of inquiry, said, how are we creating those problems we're creating? And a very important inquiry. There was no teaching, there was facilitation, which was pretty helpful. I think Bill was particularly helpful in this, in getting a guy called Peter Senge involved, who wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. I helped him launch that, and Bill was quite involved with that. Gradually was development of a series of skills. The idea was that people in business don't have time to learn as you might learn through a slower learning process. How much time have I got to learn? So the idea was, as you do introduce skills, you may not have to learn all of them. You could leapfrog a bit ahead. The danger of it is, of course, that all you do is teach skills and don't get to understanding how to think together well. But if you understand the skills and how to use them, they're very beneficial. If you don't understand them, they become a bit of a handicap, to be honest.
I was thinking, is that where the term a toolkit comes from? Is the toolkit more when you don't really understand them and they're just a set of ways of doing things that you take on because they look right or fit?
Well, address it briefly now, which is the thing we're working with is consciousness. What we're aware of in terms of how we think and feel, make sense of things. If we go upstream from our actions and our immediate responses, it's how do we make sense of everything? And if we don't make sense of things in a helpful way, if it gets broken up, that's when we start to act in a counterproductive way. So how do we deal with consciousness? Well, the skills structure that a little bit. They give a structure for how you might think. If that structure is fixed, it goes against the flow. So the structure has to be indicative rather than fixed. And we could perhaps explore that in terms of skills at another time.
Yeah, I think we will. I think your first consulting gig was with BP in Grangemouth.
Yeah.
You can tell it's a bit in my kind of, maybe it's in your model through the way you write, but in my inquiry, as it was your first day at school, your first paid job. Now this is your first consulting. Could you tell us about that? What you did, what you learnt? What's the story of what happened at Grangemouth?
Yeah, so somebody who'd helped with the LCI had a colleague who was one of the executive leaders at Grangemouth. Grangemouth at that time was one of the biggest industrial sites in the United Kingdom, huge, and suggested to her boyfriend, I guess, partner, that maybe I could help with dialogue. And I went along and talked with them. Actually, I invited Bill into the very beginning of that, so he was involved in the first months of that. It's a big site that had a pipeline coming from the North Sea, bringing crude oil into Scotland, near Edinburgh. And maybe 85% of the fuel for the UK at that time came down that pipeline into Grangemouth. It then had a refinery that purified that fuel so it could be used industrially for vehicles, cars and so on. And it also had a chemicals plant that then took some of the output from the refinery and turned it into useful products for industry. So this is a big business. The three businesses, the pipeline, the refinery and the chemical plant, had different leadership. They each reported to a head office, as I had done from my little depot in Battersea through to the head office and scaffolding company. They each reported to different people in the head office. So they were being directed from head office although they were on the same site and interrelated. The same crude oil went to the refinery and went onto the chemicals plant. They were all interrelated, but they were being instructed from a distance. They also had 4 unions, 4 quite militant unions, and the 4 unions didn't compete with each other, didn't like each other very much, and argued a lot. So the 3 businesses with different directives, the 4 unions, were in a bit of a challenging situation. But Margaret Thatcher had very successfully de-toothed the unions, so they didn't have much say, they were weaker. But Tony Blair, coming back in, had done a deal saying you'll be able to do collective bargaining again. That means the unions determine the pay structure. When they had that before, it was a very serious problem. Each negotiation brought the plants to a standstill. So they could anticipate within a year, they'll be back to collective bargaining and things were going to get far worse. And as a consultant, a dialogic consultant, what did I think? What did Bill think? That was the beginning of that consulting intervention. Of course, what we thought was, let's find out actually what the problem is, not only from your point of view, but other people's point of view. And what do you think you should do? What the executive thought we should do is stitch it up so that the unions can't look like we're going to be helpful, but actually make sure they can't cause trouble. And we thought, I wonder if the unions might see through that kind of approach. Like, everybody knows people are trying to manage each other and so on. So we proposed the spirit of dialogue and dialogic work is to be open, to be quite transparent. This is what we're trying to do. What are you trying to do? How could we work this together? So we proposed what I'd call a radically transparent approach. Hide nothing and be totally open. That sounded extremely dangerous to the executive. It took a few days for them to be willing to consider that. And when we talked with the unions, it sounded extremely dangerous to them too, because they were pretty good at choosing the right moment to make public difficult things to get an advantage over management. But in the end, and Bill helped get the initial piece in place, but I went there every month for 3 years. And in the end, we created a council which included senior executives, senior union leaders, and representation of all the skilled technical workers, where every month we talked about what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and the issues and how to manage them. And that went from strategic decisions about changing product and changing the number of employees. It went down to safety issues, down to day-to-day concerns. It was an extraordinary situation. Where we had major problems, the site was so big that used to appear in the House of Commons. An explosion in the plant would be questioned, be in Prime Minister's question time about what was being done. By the end of our council, 3 years later, when something came up, we'd invite the Member of Parliament to come and sit in the monthly meeting. Actually sit in there and say, man, you guys are really working this out together. They understood the level of cooperation. If rather than trying to get advantage yourself, the way I described it was, we're playing cards, we each got our own hand, we've got our trumps, we've got our good and bad cards. Let's lay all our cards on the table and work out the best way to play this. Like all of them, actually let's lay them out and work out the best way. That's how you create a container with 3,000 people in a major industrial plant that has big problems. I know when the Twin Towers went down in New York, I was on one of my trips. The big fear was that there might be bombs on Grangemouth that would stop immediately all the oil in the UK. So it was a big plant, but this radical openness, and we brought management and union into the Leadership for Collective Intelligence program we mentioned. Radical openness is how you create a large container. Now, how to become open is the question Now, if your dialogue skills help you to become more open so you get to that feel of working together, then they're terrific. And I advocate dialogue skills.
In your book, you do go on to describe more of the places within BP that you worked, more of the business units and between business units.
I mean,
maybe you could just give us a highlight of those.
We're revealing now this is BP.
Oh, yes.
Okay. When BP sold that, the guy who took it on became one of the richest men in the UK, out of interest, sponsoring Formula One racing now. Mm-hmm. But I was invited from that, and as was Bill, to work in other, they called it a business unit, in other business units within BP. Over the years, I worked in over 20 different business units, some of them at great length, some starting up the businesses, some combining businesses, some closing them down. That experience of creating a council where all the players had a seat, for example, BP had maybe a dozen different businesses working in China, and in China doing business from UK-US company is challenging. Understanding connections with the government at that point was a challenge, and so on. Again, I created a council where everybody participated. Nobody could tell each other what to do, but they effectively laid their cards down openly and together learned how to do it better. And there are a whole range of really interesting stories about what you can do if, as a consultant, you're working with the whole organization and allowing the whole organization to move from a fragmented situation to one which is working systemically and thinking that way. So that really did help me hugely in terms of consulting experience to stay in one large organization with a terrific CEO. John Brown at the time was really a very enlightened CEO. I learned a lot about consultation and decision-making from the interactions around him.
Yeah. This theme of radical transparency has come up a couple of times in those stories, and I think we pick up on that in a different organisational context next episode. For now, I have to move us on to the final chapter of this episode, where you start to describe the organisational theory that you've developed out of all of these experiences. The chapter is called Yet Another Organisation, so I think you later on talk about yet another fucking reorganisation, which may be how people in organisations feel about it.
I don't know if that gets beeped or not, but that I have heard that adjective included often. So where my inquiry took me from my first day at school through to this point was they're called organisations. That's interesting. Like, what do they organise? And I'd never really thought, what do they organise? Do they organise people? Do they organise money? What is this? Well, I think you could have a number of answers. The relevant one for me in my work and my experience running businesses and consulting, so they organise power. Organisations are a structure of power. And what I mean by a structure of power is people have a certain authority to make decisions. The power is the authority to make decisions, and with that, the accountability to make the right decisions. So as I structure my organization, I say, Jane, would you like to be the CEO, the leader of this organization? If so, this is the authority I give you. This is the accountability I expect. And you in turn delegate that down through your organization. So if you take that view that it's a power structure, and that's what you're doing, you see the delegations of authority going right down. As a manager of a depot, this is what you can decide to hire a vehicle, but you can't decide to buy one, for example. You've got to escalate some things higher up to get there and so on. That's the nature of the organization. When you realize that, if you follow the lines of power, what I call power lines, Many of them are hierarchical. So those I've described so far, hierarchical means the executive hands down to the managers, who hand down to the supervisors and so on. The organization could be run in what are called silos. A silo is where you have a lot of grain and it all comes out at the bottom. A silo is what you have to do is what's required by the person above you. It's very successful model. But there are other power lines. There are power lines that run across them that are what you typically call the functions. So functionally, the person who's in charge of capital expenditure on transport was the one deciding whether or not I could get a new vehicle. Now, was that a contribution? A huge contribution to the effectiveness and profitability of the company having these lateral power lines. And the lateral power lines that include your HR, they include your legislation, your legal functions and so on, and then your vertical lines, which are hierarchical, which run your main business, they have to live together. Now, you're often finding you're answering 2 or 3 different people. Operationally, I've got to get the goods out the door. Functionally, I've got to meet certain requirements where I can't allow my driver to drive more hours. And I've got to meet legal requirements about whether this is done properly or not. Now, those are challenging to everybody, and people reorganize to give preference to one or the other. Like, let's really get the operations working, or let's really get this meeting requirements and so on. And there are reorganizations typically of each new leader coming in. What's the dialogic contribution? The dialogic contribution is to put in one room, in one circle, the vertical power lines, the hierarchical power lines, the lateral lines where they're relevant. It might be 2 power lines. So it might be product, different product lines that are affecting each other. Might be different geographies that are vertical lines, but put the relevant groupings together and think about it. There isn't an answer from above about how these different functions should work. Where they must all come together is in the executive group. The CEO and his senior leadership team should have in their representation of all his operational lines and all his functional lines. This is where they all come together and should work. It is remarkable when you see sometimes, you look at some filming, for example, of the Prime Minister with his ministers. That's a CEO's with his executive. You see how he or she is seated, or none of those ministers can contribute to the thinking round the table. It's not designed that way. It's not using the collective intelligence of that leadership group. So
saying around the table doesn't seem quite right when you see this really long rectangle.
It's kind of a non-dialogic approach can be quite dictatorial, and there are wonderful anecdotal stories about how dictatorial, for example, government is. So what we introduced was a way of thinking together as a group and managing these. One successful example, if I nip back briefly into BP, was an operational group I helped start, where every month we would have the CEO and the heads of each of the operations, which were in that case geographic, the country heads of the product that was being distributed, and the functional heads. And they'd sit together around one circular table and look at what was needed and what was being done. Because they were all there, you would make one decision and everybody knew what it was and how they were managing it. And you wouldn't tell people, you'd say, this is what I think we should do. What do you all think? Well, it would impact me this way, it would impact that. And people start to not only represent their country, Germany or Turkey, or their product line, but actually what's best for this whole business, and have some terrific, deeper conversations about the right decisions to make. It would be a bit worse for us in Germany, to be honest, but it would be better overall to do that, and we'll get that to happen, kind of thing. So that's the radical offer that thinking about organizations as power lines is to create what I call power centers that include the relevant players, and either one-off, which is a consulting intervention, or periodically. We ought to review at a periodic level how our interrelationships are working. There's so much that can be done organizationally from this perspective.
I think this would be a good time to hear from our guest, Meg, who I think has a relevant question.
Hi, Peter. It's easy to see the challenges that are posed by organizations, and you've mentioned a lot of those hierarchies and allocations of power and decision-making structures, but aren't there also some natural opportunities there?
Great, Meg. Thank you for your research and reading and thinking about this. I appreciate it a lot. And the simple answer is yes. The longer answer, of course, is if I go back to trying to make Stone Age implements, what do I see? I see the hills, I see the trees, I see the landscape. At night I see the stars, hear the insects as evening comes. What do I see as I sit here now? I see everything in a rectilinear frame, horizontal floors and ceilings, vertical walls. I see doors, I see windows, I see carpets outside my car with other cars parked on roads. Organizations have made all of this. They've made the roads, they've made the buildings, they've made everything. So we live within organizations. So the huge success story is organizations. Organizations lead to us having a longer life, a healthier life, and doing what we're doing. They're incredible. All over the world, they're succeeding. But at a cost. The cost is that it's driven in a particularly fragmented way. So why are we concerned about the environment? Why are we concerned about global warming? Because we're impacting it hugely. So our wonderfully successful organizations are causing trouble, and our attention is how do we fix that trouble? But at some point we have to think, how do we stop causing this trouble that we then have to go and fix? So the answer is organizations have huge value and we all benefit from that, and they have a huge cost, and we have to learn how to manage that cost. We won't work our way out of the problems through science. The problem is in consciousness, it's taken huge cost in form, but we have to work out how to come at this a different way. And that's the dialogic, transparent, extreme opency we're looking to find.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Meg. Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. We can only scratch the surface of what's inside the book with the time we have. So if you want to dig deeper into these stories and learnings, you can buy A New Kind of Dialogue on Amazon, Waterstones, or at any other good bookstore. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Join us next time as we discuss chapters 16, 17 and 18, where Peter begins to codify and define exactly what dialogue is, introducing and establishing crucial frameworks that explain the depth of the practice. And we'll hear from Parveen Daipur from the Endless Way of Dialogue Institute in Tehran.